the letter arrived on Tuesday morning, and it was not addressed to her at all. It was addressed to her father, the old Earl of Hallowmere, 3 weeks dead by then, his chair at the head of the table still left empty out of a habit no one in the house had yet found the courage to break. The letter had come from his solicitor in London, and it concerned the reading of his will, an event the family had been dreading and craving in equal measure since the day they buried him. Catherine Hallowmere sat at the far end of that long table, in a black gown that had once belonged to her mother, and watched her elder brother break the seal with hands that were not quite steady. She did not know, as she watched him read, that the next few minutes would decide the whole shape of the rest of her life. She did not know that a single sentence, one her brother would read aloud with barely concealed contempt, was about to hand her something the family believed was nothing at all, and that within 5 years that nothing would be worth more than everything her brother had been given in its place. Her father's will, when James finally found his voice to read it, was simple enough in its cruelty. The great house, Hallowmere itself, with its rolling parkland and its rents and its long, proud history, passed entirely to James, as everyone had always known it must. And to Catherine, his only daughter, unmarried at 8 and 20, and therefore, in the family's quiet estimation. Something of a disappointment went a single piece of property, Fenmoor Farm, 40 acres of low, wet ground at the edge of the estate that had not turned a profit in a generation, and that her father in life had referred to only ever as the worthless corner. Give her the worthless farm, their father had apparently instructed his solicitor some years before, in a phrase so careless and so final that James read it aloud without even the courtesy of softening it. She has no head for anything grander, and it will keep her from becoming a burden to the estate. No one at that table looked at Catherine when the words were read. No one needed to. She felt the shame of it settle over her like the cold of the room itself, not shame at the inheritance, but at the plain, unkind truth beneath it, that her own father, to the very end, had thought so little of her that a patch of flooded, useless ground seemed to him a fitting measure of her worth. She did not weep. She had learned, over 8 and 20 years in that house, that weeping changed nothing. She simply folded her hands in her lap and said, quietly, that she was grateful for whatever her father had seen fit to leave her, and excused herself from the table before anyone could see what the words had truly cost her. She did not know then that Fenmore Farm held, buried beneath its wet, unloved fields, a secret that would take her 5 patient years to uncover, and that the very worthlessness her father had assigned to it was, in the end, the greatest misjudgment of his life. Before we go further into what Catherine found in that flooded ground, I want to pause for just a moment, because I think you'll want to stay for this one. If stories of quiet, underestimated women outlasting the careless judgments of powerful men are the kind that keep you coming back to this channel, then please take a moment now to subscribe, so you don't miss what comes next. And down in the comments, in these first few minutes, tell me, where in the world are you watching from tonight? I love reading where these old English stories find their way to. Now, let us return to Catherine, and to the farm no one believed was worth a second glance. Catherine Hallowmere had never been the daughter her father wanted. She knew this the way one knows the weather, not as a wound freshly given, but as a condition of the climate she had lived inside her whole life. Her mother had died when she was 11, and in the years that followed, her father's affection had settled entirely and without apology upon his son, the heir, the future of the name. Catherine had been educated adequately, dressed respectably, and largely ignored, in the particular way great houses ignore daughters who fail to secure advantageous marriages and therefore cease, in the family's private ledger of usefulness, to serve much purpose at all. She had once been engaged, briefly at 2 and 20, to a baronet's son who broke the arrangement quietly when a wealthier match presented itself elsewhere. Her father had not consoled her. He had simply remarked, over dinner that same evening, that she ought to have secured him more firmly, as though the failure of the engagement were a fault of craftsmanship rather than a wound to the heart. She had not cried in front of him then either. In the weeks after the will was read, Catherine watched her brother settle into Hallowmere with the easy, unthinking comfort of a man stepping into clothes tailored precisely to his shape. James was not cruel, exactly. He simply belonged in a way she never had, and belonging, she had come to understand, made a person careless of those who did not. He offered, almost as an afterthought, to let her keep a room at the house rather than remove herself to the farm at all. "No one expects you to actually live out there," he said, not unkindly, but with the particular blindness of a man who cannot imagine why anyone would choose difficulty over comfort. "The place is barely fit for sheep." Catherine thanked him and told him she intended to go regardless. It was her cousin Reginald Hallowmere who objected most loudly to that decision. Reginald, who had spent the better part of a decade quietly positioning himself as James's most trusted advisor, and who had, Catherine suspected, hoped for a rather larger share of the estate himself than a distant cousin's claim could ever honestly justify. Reginald visited her the week before she left, ostensibly to wish her well, and spent the better part of an hour explaining, in the patient tone of a man addressing someone he considers not quite capable of following him, why Fenmore was unsuitable for a gentlewoman, why she ought to sell whatever claim she had to him for a modest sum, and why he would be only too glad to relieve her of a burden so plainly beneath her. Catherine listened to all of it with the same calm, unreadable politeness she had perfected over 28 years of being spoken over at that very table. When he had finished, she thanked him for his concern and told him she had already engaged a cart for Thursday. She did not know then that Reginald's interest in her worthless farm, an interest he took such evident pains to disguise as pity, would return to trouble her again in a far more dangerous form, once the ground beneath Fenmore proved rather less worthless than either of them yet suspected. She did not fully understand, herself, why she felt so drawn to that low, wet, unwanted ground. Perhaps it was only that it was hers, the first thing in her life that had ever been entirely her own, however little anyone else believed it worth having. Perhaps it was something else entirely, some instinct she could not yet name. She did not know then that the instinct was, in its way, a kind of inheritance too, passed down not from her father, who had never once set foot on Fenmore in her memory, but from her mother, whose old letters, packed away and forgotten in a trunk Catherine had not opened in years, held the first small clue to everything that followed. Fenmoor Farm, when she arrived there that autumn, with little more than a single trunk and a hired cart, was every bit as bleak as its reputation promised. The farmhouse itself was small and damp, its thatch gone soft and grey with neglect. The fields beyond it lay low and waterlogged, crossed by a sluggish stream that flooded, the local tenant farmer warned her, nearly every spring, drowning whatever crop had been foolish enough to take root there. It was, by every practical measure the county could offer, precisely the worthless corner her father had always called it. And yet, on her very first evening there, walking the boundary of the property, as the light failed and a fine mist rose off the low fields, Catherine felt something she had not felt in the whole grand splendour of Hallowmere in years. She felt, for the first time in a very long while, that she was standing somewhere that was entirely, unquestionably her own, and that no one, not her brother, not her father's memory, not the whole disapproving weight of the county, could take it from her. She did not know then that the mist rising from those low fields carried, in the mineral tang of the water itself, the very secret that would change everything. It was old Mr. Hobden, the tenant farmer who had worked the edges of Fenmore for 30 years without ever quite making a living from it, who first mentioned the spring. He mentioned it almost apologetically, one grey morning, while showing Catherine the worst of the flooded lower field, a spot where the ground never properly dried even in high summer, fed, he said, by some underground spring that had always run strange. He remembered, as a boy, his own father complaining that the water there left a queer taste and a queerer smell, faintly of rotten eggs, and that nothing much would grow near it. Catherine, who had read a good deal more than her father had ever credited her for, felt a small, private spark of curiosity at that description. A smell she half recognized from a book on mineral springs she had once borrowed, out of idle interest, from the Hallowmere library. She said nothing of it to Hobden. But she did not forget it either. She did not know then that this single offhand memory of a farmer's boyhood would in time prove more valuable to her than the whole of Hallomere's rolling acres. The winter that followed was a hard one, and it was during those long housebound weeks that Catherine first climbed into the farmhouse's low attic in search of dry firewood, and found instead a small locked chest pushed far back beneath the eaves, thick with dust and cobweb, clearly untouched for a generation. The lock gave way easily enough to a kitchen knife, and inside she found not treasure, as some foolish part of her had briefly hoped, but paper, a bundle of household accounts and a slim, water-stained journal belonging to a woman named Agnes Fenmore, who had, according to the flyleaf, kept the farm some 50 years before, long before it had ever come into Hallowmere hands at all. Agnes Fenmore's journal was, for the most part, exactly what one would expect of a farmer's wife: weather, harvests, small domestic worries. But threaded through the final months of entries, in a hand grown increasingly urgent, was a different story entirely. Agnes wrote of a queer spring in the lower field, of a travelling physician who had once tested its waters and pronounced them richer than any he had seen outside Derbyshire, and of a local landowner, she did not name him outright, referring to him only as the gentleman from the great house, who had heard of the physician's interest and moved, swiftly and without much ceremony, to acquire the Fenmore land for a fraction of its true worth before the family could act on the discovery themselves. The final entry, dated only months before the farm apparently changed hands, reads simply, "We are told the water is worthless after all, and must sell. I do not believe it, but a widow with 3 children has little strength left to argue with gentlemen." Catherine sat with that journal for a long time in the cold attic light, and felt something harden quietly inside her that had not been there before. She did not know then, with certainty, that the gentleman from the great house spoken of in Agnes Fenmore's journal was in fact her own great-grandfather, but she suspected it long before she found the deed of purchase, tucked among the Hallowmere estate papers months later, that confirmed it beyond doubt. The worthless corner of ground her father had so carelessly discarded, it seemed, had been quietly valuable once before, and quietly stolen from a woman with no one left to speak for her. Catherine intended, from that cold winter afternoon onward, to see that history did not repeat itself a second time. It was her mother's letters, discovered quite by accident some months later, while sorting through the last of the trunk she had finally brought herself to open. That gave Catherine the second piece of the puzzle. Her mother, it turned out, had grown up not far from a small spa town in Derbyshire, and had written, in a letter to her own sister decades earlier, with real excitement about the mineral springs there, waters, she said, that fashionable society was beginning to travel considerable distances to take for their supposed benefits to health, and that were, in more than one case, making the modest landowners who happened to sit upon them very comfortable indeed. Catherine read that letter 3 times by candlelight, her heart beating with a feeling she had not allowed herself in years: hope. She did not know then that turning that hope into anything real would take 4 more years of patient, unglamorous work that would test every ounce of the resilience her family had always assumed she lacked. The years that followed were not easy ones, and I will not pretend to you that they were. Catherine spent the better part of a year simply learning what she needed to know, corresponding, quietly and without telling anyone at Hallowmere, with a chemist in Derby who agreed, for a modest fee, to examine a sample of the water she sent him by post. His reply, when it came, confirmed what she had begun to hope. The spring beneath Fenmore's worthless lower field was rich in the same mineral properties that had made those fashionable Derbyshire waters so sought after. She did not rush to announce this discovery to her brother, or to the county, or to anyone at all. She had learned by then the particular danger of revealing a valuable thing to a family that had never once valued her. Instead, she worked quietly and carefully, using what little income the rest of the farm could scrape together, and a small legacy left directly to her by her mother years before. Money James did not know she still possessed. To begin, modestly and without fanfare, the slow work of building something real around that strange, ill-smelling spring. She hired a local builder, a careful and discreet man named Mr. Ashby, to construct a simple bathing house over the spring. Nothing grand, nothing that would draw the county's attention before she was ready for it. She wrote, under a name that was not quite her own, to physicians in London who specialised in the fashionable new science of hydropathy, describing her water's properties and inviting their professional opinion. She did not know then that one of those letters would find its way, entirely by chance, into the hands of a physician already searching for precisely such a property to recommend to his most valuable patients. No one in the household at Hallowmere knew what she was building. Her brother, when he thought of her at all in those years, imagined her quietly failing at farming, exactly as their father had predicted, and felt no particular urge to visit and confirm it. It suited Catherine perfectly to let him believe it. She did not know then that Reginald knew rather more than James did. It was in the third year, with the bathing house newly finished and the first cautious visitors just beginning to arrive, that Reginald Hallowmere appeared unannounced at Fenmore's gate. Drawn, he claimed, by nothing more than cousinly concern, though Catherine noted he had ridden the 6 miles from Hallowmere with unusual speed for a man merely paying a social call. He walked the grounds with a keen, assessing eye she recognised at once, and asked, with a carelessness she did not for one moment believe, whether the old stories about a mineral spring on the property held any truth at all. Catherine told him evenly that the water was pleasant enough for bathing and nothing more, and watched him decide, with visible reluctance, to believe her. But she understood, from that day forward, that her advantage lay entirely in speed and silence, and she redoubled her efforts to secure the physician's formal recommendation before Reginald's suspicions hardened into certainty. Within the month, she had quietly arranged, through her Derby solicitor, to have her claim to the spring and the surrounding acreage recorded and secured beyond any possibility of dispute. A precaution that would prove, before another year had passed, very nearly the only thing standing between her and losing everything a second time. For Reginald did not let the matter rest. Twice more in that year he returned, each time with some new pretext, and once he arrived while Mr. Ashby's men were laying the foundations for the guest lodgings, an activity impossible to disguise as anything but exactly what it was. He said nothing to her directly that day, but she saw the calculation move behind his eyes. And within a fortnight she learned, through Hobden's careful listening at the local inn, that Reginald had begun making quiet inquiries of his own, asking after the ownership of the land, after whether a woman's claim to such a property might be challenged on some point of the old will's wording, after whether the family solicitor might be persuaded to find some flaw in the original bequest that had never troubled anyone while the land was believed worthless. She did not know then how close Reginald came to succeeding. The solicitor, to his credit, found no such flaw to exploit, however diligently Reginald pressed him to look for one. Catherine's own careful recording of her claim, made in that same anxious third year, had closed the door before Reginald ever thought to try the handle. When he understood at last that the ground had shifted beneath him, and that the worthless farm he had once offered to relieve her of for a modest sum was now entirely, unassailably hers. He did not trouble her with any more visits at all. It was, Catherine reflected afterward, the closest thing to an apology a man like Reginald was ever likely to offer. It was in the 4th year that everything began, quite suddenly, to change. The physician's recommendation, once given, carried more weight than Catherine had dared hope. A small trickle of visitors became a steady stream, modest gentry at first then, as word spread through the particular gossip that travels fastest among the fashionable and the unwell, families of genuine standing, willing to pay handsomely for lodging near waters, said to ease everything from rheumatism to nervous complaint. Catherine, with Mr. Ashby's careful help, expanded the bathing house, then added simple guest lodgings, then a small tea room where visitors could take refreshment while they waited their turn at the waters. She did not know then that her brother's own fortunes, in that same period, had begun quietly to decline, that the grand house he had inherited so easily was proving a far heavier burden than he had ever imagined. Its roof and its rents and its long history all requiring money faster than the estate's tired old farmland could produce it. By the 5th year, Fenmore Spa, for that was what the county had begun calling it, with a mixture of astonishment and grudging respect, was earning more in a single season than Hallowmere's entire remaining farmland earned in 3. Catherine Hallowmere, once dismissed as a disappointment fit only for a worthless corner of wet ground, had become, without any of the county quite noticing the transformation happen, a woman of genuine, independent fortune. It was James who finally came to see it for himself. In the autumn of that 5th year, drawn as much by curiosity as by the increasingly uncomfortable rumours reaching him at Hallowmere that his sister's forgotten farm was somehow thriving, while his own inheritance quietly struggled. He arrived to find a property he did not recognise. The old damp farmhouse had been carefully restored and extended. A neat gravel drive led visitors past trimmed hedges to a handsome bathing house of pale stone, steam rising gently from its windows in the cool autumn air. Well-dressed guests strolled the grounds Catherine had once walked alone in the failing light, taking the air between their treatments, and more than one nodded to her with the particular deference reserved for a woman of consequence. He found her in the small office she had built for herself, going over accounts with the same quiet, careful attention she had once given to her mother's letters, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment before he could bring himself to speak. "Father called this place worthless," he said at last. "He did," Catherine agreed, without looking up. "I believe those were his exact words. It is worth more now than Hallowmere's entire farmland puts together." He said it quietly, and there was something in his voice she had not heard from him before. Not quite shame, but close enough to it. "I know," she said. And then, because she found to her own surprise that she did not wish to make him suffer for it, she added, more gently, "You were not unkind to me, James. You simply never thought of me at all. I have found, in these 5 years, that being overlooked is sometimes its own strange gift. No one troubles to interfere with a thing they believe holds no value." He did not know what to say to that, and so he said nothing, and stood instead, looking out at the grounds his sister had built from nothing but wet ground and quiet persistence, while she returned, calmly, to her accounts. It was Reginald, oddly enough, who arrived at Fenmore a second time that same season, invited this time by James, who had begun to lean on his cousin's advice rather more heavily as Hallowmere's finances tightened. Catherine received him in the small parlour she had furnished with her own earnings, and watched, with an interest that was almost scholarly, as he attempted to reconstruct, before her own brother, the very same offer of quiet assistance he had once made her as a favour to a helpless woman, only now addressed, with considerably more deference, to a woman he had once tried to relieve of a farm he believed worthless. She declined his renewed interest as evenly as she had declined his first, and had the private satisfaction of watching him understand, at last and in full, exactly how badly he had once misjudged her. The reckoning that followed was not a dramatic one, and I think that is, in its way, the truest part of this story. There was no grand public humiliation, no scene of vengeance Catherine might once have imagined, in bitterer moments, that she deserved. There was simply the slow, undeniable fact of what she had built, standing in plain view of a family that had never believed her capable of building anything at all. Within another year, it was James, not Catherine, who came quietly asking for help, alone against Fenmore's earnings, to see Hallowmere's tenants through a hard winter. Offered with none of the old careless authority he had once worn so easily. Catherine gave it, not out of any wish to prove a point, but because she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she no longer needed to prove anything at all. The worthless farm had done that work for her, patiently and without fanfare, over 5 long years. She never married in the end, though she was asked, more than once, by men who had somehow failed to notice her when she possessed nothing but a disappointing name and a flooded field. She found she did not much mind their oversight. She had built, in that unwanted corner of ground her father discarded so carelessly, a life entirely of her own devising, respected at last, not for a marriage or a name, but for her own patient hands and her own quiet mind, precisely the things her family had spent a lifetime insisting she did not possess. She kept her mother's letters, always, in the same trunk that had first pointed her toward the spring, and she told her nieces and nephews, in later years, that the most valuable thing anyone had ever given her was a piece of land everyone else had already decided was worth nothing at all, because it had taught her, better than any grander inheritance ever could have, that worth is rarely where the careless choose to look for it. If Catherine's story kept you company tonight, I hope you will subscribe before you go, and leave a comment below telling me where you watched from, and which part of her quiet victory stayed with you longest. There are a great many more forgotten corners of Old England still waiting to be discovered, and I would be glad of your company the next time we go looking. Thank you for staying with this one until the end. Good night.